Hey everybody, welcome back to Leosity. This is the first in the business series, and this particular episode is going to be about why you should start a business if you're remotely entrepreneurial minded, especially right now with everything going on, the instability of things, as well as the types of businesses that there are to choose from. Now, before I get started on any of that, just a little disclaimer. Do I think everyone should start a business in America? No, I don't. But I do think that people who are more inclined to watch these kinds of vids are going to be entrepreneurially minded. And I would also like to add that just because you start a business doesn't mean that you have everything you need to make one flourish. Quite often, it takes multiple personality types to really make a business work. But there are some exceptions, and some of those exceptions in particular are the kinds of endeavors that people who are entrepreneurially minded and watch, videos on BitChute would be inclined to benefit from. So, the biggest reason why I think anybody who is thinking about starting a venture or has already started some sort of business like endeavor should have a business is the corporate veil. That's one of the biggest reasons. And I'm going to repeatedly, just because it's a fun and really in some ways it's almost cliche, but it's a fun way of describing a business. I'm going to be using the whole lemonade stand probably throughout this video. But let's just say you want to start your own business. It doesn't matter really what it is. You just want to start a lemonade stand, even though you're an adult. And you go to the bank and you show your business model and you show the money that you need for a loan, and this is how many lemons you need and this is how much sugar you need and all that. And instead of creating a business entity, you just go in as an individual. There's a problem, and that is you have no corporate veil. So a year into your business, you're making some degree of money, and somebody gets food poisoning from your lemonade and they sue you. They can go after your personal assets, they can go after your house, they can go after your car, they can go after a lot of things that belong to you as an individual. But let's say you started a business entity instead. One, the bank's going to like that a lot better, and they're more inclined to give you a loan to begin with, sometimes a forgivable loan. And secondly, somebody sues you, they can only go after the business's assets. So if your business is paying you adequately and you're minimizing the amount of assets are in that business, and you don't pierce that corporate veil by using the business's money for personal expenses, what happens is you end up getting a lot of protection that you wouldn't otherwise have, because it's two separate things. There's your business and there's you. And you're not necessarily liable in many instances. There are obvious exceptions for things that your business does, or even for things that you do operating as the owner of said entity. So that's the biggest reason, is that corporate veil, that separation of assets that really protects you on many levels. The other reason why you might want to start a business is for tax purposes, because a lot of things that you do for your own living, if you don't start a business entity, it's treated as personal assets and personal income, and it's not something you can write off, or at least it's much harder to. Whereas if you do have a separate entity for it, even if it's just a sole proprietorship, then you have a lot more options. And the third reason why I think it's good to start a business if you have that kind of mindset is just because even if that business fails, and most businesses do, it's really good practice for you as a person. It kind of reminds me, this is cliche as all get out, but it's like that Army Strong commercial. I think creating a business, even if it fails, is a really invaluable learning experience for a person, and it can really help you grow as an individual. And one thing that a lot of people may not know, and this is something I've experienced probably every day just dealing with entrepreneurs, is people who fail with that mindset, they see it as learning opportunities, and they almost never let that bring them down. Very few people. I've joked in the past about guns, tattoos, and certain other things that you either have zero of, one of, or dozens of, and it's very similar with businesses. People either have no businesses, one business that either failed or succeeded, or several ventures that they've gone into. And it's one of those things that once you realize how easy it is and how liberating it can be, there's restrictions that go with that liberation. It can be extremely useful for a person. And I apologize, all the entities I'm about to cover that people could create, they're all American. There are usually similar instances in Europe, and it's just one of those things where there's too much to go over for other countries. So if you are from another country, research this in depth and find the equivalent. But there's really four types of businesses that an individual can start that I recommend, excluding nonprofits, which I'll get into right after that. But the first is a sole proprietorship, and it's got several advantages, but more disadvantages in my opinion, because, well, more on that in a minute. But sole proprietorship, one nice thing is you're taxed like an individual. So if you know how to fill out taxes for yourself, you can run a sole proprietorship. You don't really have to keep a lot of records for it. So it's just very easy to start. The problem is that that corporate veil is pretty dang thin, first of all. You know, you've got minimal protection for personal assets. And then the other big reason is you can't really expand upon it. Once you have a sole proprietorship, unless you completely restructure and change that entity, you're kind of stuck as just you. And it's very difficult for a person to create that growth mindset I was talking about if it's just you, because there's no distinction. So I don't recommend sole proprietorships. There's something a lot newer, several years old at this point, probably 15 years old at this point, something like that. But LLCs are far better in that respect, because an LLC can be a sole proprietorship or a partnership. It can be multiple different things, and it's more versatile. It can expand. So if you start an LLC as just you're the only part of that LLC, same rules apply. You're basically paying taxes as an individual, but you can write off business expenses, which is nice. The corporate veil is definitely thicker, as long as you don't pierce it. And the only real, you can even expand into a publicly traded company using an LLC. So loads of advantages. The only real disadvantages is if you're looking for something with much more massive expansion, you might want to start off with something a little grander, and that leads to C-Corps. C-Corps are enormously advantageous because the things you can do with them is a lot grander. For starters, you're not liable for most of the things that the business does. It's a lot harder for you to be directly involved, even if it's your business and you're the majority shareholder. You can also have an unlimited number of shareholders for a C Corp. The downside is that you get taxed twice. You get taxed as a income recipient, as a shareholder, in other words, but you also have to pay taxes for said business. You also have to file regularly, and you have to stay in compliance with whatever state and federal rules there happen to be. And it's a lot stricter. There's a lot tighter record keeping. But even with that, what's really nice about it is if you plan on having something really grandiose, and you really want to make a selling point of the fact that, people can invest and be part of that and grow it from there, then a C Corp is really what you want. And in between the LLC and the C Corp is the S Corp. It maxes out at 100 shareholders, so that's one of the big issues. But similarly, you're not liable for things, and so there's a flexibility of that between the LLC and the C Corp. For the most part, what I personally see, I usually recommend an LLC for just about anybody on their business ventures, because, especially if they're first timer, because it might fail. It's very likely to fail, and it provides you a lot of flexibility just in terms of how the day-to-day operations are going to take place. It's a good learning experience. And a lot of people, they just stick with an LLC their whole life. Whereas another possibility, again, if you got something big, if you want to be the next SpaceX or something, then a C Corp. S Corp for me is less common, and I very rarely, if ever, recommend people just be a sole proprietorship. And lastly, that brings me, since we were talking about taxes, to nonprofits. Now, nonprofits are if you have the intention of doing a common good. And the big advantage of a nonprofit is, contrary to the name, you can still make money from a nonprofit. In fact, you can get grants and other forms of funding that a lot of for-profit businesses can't access, including a number of government grants. Not to say private entities can't get grants, but because you're trying to help some sort of community, you don't pay taxes. So that's a big plus, at least in the US. And there's a number of ways to be a nonprofit. You don't have to be the March of Dimes type charity. You don't have to be working soup kitchens, which nothing wrong with that. In fact, I encourage people to do that sort of thing. But there's a number of possibilities for a 501c3. That's the most common nonprofit. There are other instances of it. There are, for example, like I think a C4 is like Chamber of Commerce's, and then C5 is unique. That's agricultural nonprofits. What's unique about that is it's the only one that you can lobby the government with, and that's just if it's agriculturally related. So this is just food for thought for people to get started on, and there's going to be a lot more talk about just the overall lifespan and goals and nuts and bolts of starting and running a business in future installments of this series. So like, share, subscribe, keep asking questions. Bye.